As a librarian, I don't often, if ever, have a whole semester with students. The project that I've been working with the journalism students works because I see them several times over several years. The project that I did for my SoTL happened in one class, in actually about half an hour within one class. And that's where I gathered the data for the project. The project was around student reading of scholarly articles, and it's very much in the what is category. I don't know what works. I have some suspicions, but I was interested in what's happening when students are reading scholarly articles, with the view, of course, to, and then, if we know what's happening, what can we do to maybe make that less challenging and more productive time for them? And like Glenn, I started with a big question that, you know, if I had 2 psychics and 3 MRI machines, I might have gotten close to answering, but that just wasn't going to happen. So it was a process of narrowing down with the Nixon cohort, what can I actually do? What can I actually do? What can I actually get evidence for? And focused on an aspect of connections of reading that's always intrigued me, and that's connection making, and how students make connections or don't to academic articles. Because in some of the work that I do with students, it's pretty clear that a lot of them see this metaphorical wall between them and scholarly articles. And when they do start reading scholarly articles, they tend to be reading them in isolation and not making those connections. Not, as I've put it, going from the salad paper of chunks of information to a stew paper where those pieces of information have actually informed each other and flavored each other. So I focused on this connections aspect. In the class, so the question then became, what connections do students make, or can students make when reading scholarly articles? So in a class where I have taught a session on how to read a scholarly article before, this is a 3rd year public relations research methods class, I asked them at one point to read a chunk of text of a scholarly article in their discipline, write note spark points, what sparked a connection, what sparked an idea that reminded them of something else that they'd read or seen or that their sister had done that drove them crazy, and then to write that connection down. And so we took about 4 paragraphs of the text and just had them do that. That was about 30 minutes. That generated, from the 30 students who consented to have their data part of the study, 132 connections, so separate connection statements from the students when I broke it down. And I was originally looking at what the students might connect to, because I was kind of interested, you know, are they going to connect to popular media? Are they going to connect to other classes? Are they going to connect to their personal lives? But as I was going through the connections, using a phenomenographic approach, which means you go through the data a lot to look for patterns of variation. And one of the reasons, and I can talk a lot about phenomenography, and as a matter of fact, shameless plug, in January there will be a session on phenomenography. But essentially you go through and you look for patterns and the variations, and I kept reading it, and there was another story there. And that story was not just what the students were connecting to, that was okay, just like you, I kind of changed my question, right? But what was more interesting was how the students were making the connections and what that said about their reading. So there were some students who were connecting on the word, so the article said something about near Sundre, Alberta. Oh, Sundre, that's where my grandmother lives, right? So they're just really connecting on the word. In that case, to a personal life. There were other connections that sort of summarized the text and connected the text, which is about the oil patch versus agriculture in Alberta, essentially, to similar situations, oil patch and agriculture in Alberta. And then there were students or connections that were made, and I'll talk about the difference between connections versus students. There were connections that were made that showed a deeper understanding of the meaning. So the students were making analogies of, this is like the blood diamonds problem, where you have industry going into people who work on the land and destroying the environment. Or this is like settler First Nations conflicts, where you have people with money coming into an area that doesn't have as much money and conflicting over land. So they, in order to make that kind of connection, they really had to understand the meaning beyond just the words of the text. And they had to have understood this as part of a larger pattern. And other kinds of deeper connections were connections that connected to practice. how it would inform discussions of prior practice, like in the 50s when everybody liked each other, this would have been much easier. Or this is a good notion for public relations practitioners to take to the future. You must engage the public, kind of thing. So connections to practice and other connections. So in seeing that, I could see that there were deeper and more surface connections being made, which, as it happens, ties very conveniently into the dialogue of phenomenography. But what was interesting was when I took those connections back and linked them up to the individual student, it wasn't that one student was making surface connections and one student was making deep connections. Students were making both kinds and everything in between. It was like watching them focus a telephoto lens on the text. So sometimes the words were in focus, and sometimes the meaning was in focus and the actual words were blurry. So it was really interesting. And from the reading and from the background reading that I've done, that reading the meaning of the text actually makes it easier for the student to integrate that into knowledge structures. If they're reading for meaning, it makes it harder for them to recall the details. So it sort of depends on what you want students to do with the reading as to what kind of reading you want to maybe encourage. Findings and impact. The impact, how that informs my teaching, I have been asking students and encouraging students to make connections to readings for quite some time. And I still don't care whether they're connecting it to their personal lives or the media or academic, but I do encourage the deeper kind of connections. I'll say, try and make an analogy. What situation is this like? How would this impact on your practice? So I'm encouraging that deeper kind of connection, because the kind of reading that I want them to do is reading an article so they can incorporate it in their own research, right? I'm not asking them to read to memorize to be able to bring back numbers or data or dates or facts. I want them to read for meaning. And so by encouraging this kind of connection, which I think leads to greater understanding of meaning, or at least greater retention of meaning, I'm hoping to bridge some of those gaps and encourage them. And I'm in the process of revising a manuscript that's come back from the reviewers who, like everything, want me to add stuff and take 1,500 words out. So I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to do that, but